All right, good morning, everybody. So let's continue with the Internet of Things reality check theme. If there's one message that you get over the next 30 minutes, it is that IoT is not just a vision. It's not just a bunch of technologies. Actually, it is here and now, and there are thousands of companies that have already started on their IoT journey. You know, it's fair to say, and I think we've talked about it throughout this event, that over the last few years, we've been surrounded by the IoT hype. We've all seen the announcements about connected fridges and connected toasters and the billions of devices getting connected and the glorious vision of trillions of dollars that we will all make thanks to IoT, right? But the reality is that, in my mind, IoT is not about these things. It is about these. Yes, boots. Or more importantly, people that wear them, the frontline managers, the line of business executives, the folks that run the plants, the oil fields, the hospitals, the retail stores. And to be honest, a lot of these folks have been confused about the messaging coming from us, from the industry, right? All this focus on technology and connected devices. Because what they're really looking for is business outcomes and solutions that actually give them opportunity to make a business impact. What they really care about are things like quality, productivity, uptime, top and bottom line. So what I wanted to do is to invite you to walk in these people's shoes over the next couple of minutes and see how they are taking their first steps on the IoT journey, what projects they are implementing, and what are some of the lessons learned and best practices, but also mistakes to avoid. You know, over the last few years, I traveled over 1 million miles and went and talked to dozens and dozens of customers in pretty much all the industries, from industrial manufacturing, oil and gas, transportation, to healthcare, retail, smart cities, and so forth. And it was interesting when I talked to them about, tell me, what are you doing? How are you starting on the IoT journey? I started looking into all of these projects, and I was able to group them in sort of 4 general categories. And these 4 categories were, I call them actually fast paths to payback, and they were connected operations, remote operations, predictive analytics, preventive maintenance. Let me give you a few examples of some of these implementations, and you're probably familiar with some of them already. So let's start with Harley-Davidson. I think we all know them, right? The custom bike manufacturer. But before IoT, a couple of years ago, they used to run the company as sort of the archipelago of distinct islands, data islands, not very well connected. And as a result, it took them 18 months, or up to 18 months, from the time you and I would actually order a custom bike to when they would deliver the product. So a couple of folks, and I talked to them a couple of years ago, a couple of folks got together from different walks of life, different organizations, OT, IT, logistics, finance, in one of the plants, and said, okay, I think we can do better. So let's start connecting these things. First in our plant and start making a connecting plant, connected assembly line. But then let's connect the entire process from taking order to a delivery. And once they've done it, and I'm sort of skipping through the details here, but once they've done it, the data started flowing. They were able to optimize this whole process and reduce the time that it takes to deliver the product from 18 months to 2 weeks. They were also able to reduce the time it takes to troubleshoot a problem on the plant floor from weeks to minutes. And they improved or increased their bottom line by 3 or 4%. Now let's look at remote operations or remote asset management or remote monitoring. Probably one of the most popular, sort of the first IoT project that I've seen. And this is one of my favorite examples. It is an example of a 150-store ice cream chain in central India. And the reason I like this example is because it's simple, it's powerful, but it also is hyper-local. It actually talks about focusing on what the particular problem this company had in this part of the world, not just taking a generic solution developed in the US or Europe and transplanting it into India. Basically, their problem was that in this part of India, they have power outages quite often. So when you think about you're running an ice cream store, there's a power outage, well, you're in trouble, right? So what they did is they implemented, or they installed generators in every store. But they noticed that the store managers quite often did not turn these generators for whatever reason. So they turned into this little startup called Nimble Wireless. And these guys basically just dropped a temperature sensor, self-contained temperature sensor in each of these fridges, connected them to the network, and connected them to the sort of the feedback communication system. So now when the temperature started rising in the fridge, immediately the store manager will get an alert via text, via phone call, whatever means, and telling him, well, maybe you should check. Maybe there is a door open to the fridge. Please close it. Or maybe there was a power outage. Please turn the generator on. And the beautiful thing, again, was that the return on investment was massive. It was 500%, the return on investment in the first 12 months of them installing this system. And again, it wasn't rocket science. It was fairly straightforward. Predictive analytics. So if you look at Fanuc, obviously a robot manufacturer, the way they used to operate, they used to just install and customize the robots for, let's say, car manufacturers, make sure that the robots were working in design, and then say, okay, well, Mr. Customer, call me when you need any help. But then they discovered that if they connected these robots and started collecting data, they were able to actually glean a lot of useful information from that data. First of all, they were able to support much more of a flexible manufacturing requirements, but also start looking at the trade-offs of performance of the robot versus use of materials and so forth, and thus started to avoid the sort of a downtime incidents. And in the car manufacturing, if you look at the System 1 downtime incident, each of those will roughly cost the company $2 million. And then preventive maintenance. There's also a lot of preventive maintenance solutions, a lot of preventive maintenance providers, very vertically focused in transportation and other industries. But what I like about, let me give you an example from a mining industry. Goldcorp, BHP, or Rio are some of the companies that are implementing these types of solutions. And when you think about, I don't know how many of you have been into open pit mining in Western Australia, but it's sort of a fascinating experience. You're standing in the middle of a 2-mile wide and 1-mile deep hole in the middle of nowhere, where there's like the nearest town is a couple of 100 miles away. And then you start realizing what the problem is, right? If you see these little specks on the side of the hole, and these are actually these big hauling trucks that they have tires bigger than you, right? And every time this truck actually breaks down, it would cost the company roughly $2 million per day. And quite often, it will take days or weeks to troubleshoot what the problem was, to order parts, get the parts shipped, and actually fix the problem. So that was a perfect use case for preventive maintenance. So these companies started implementing these types of solutions. Initially, they were not very accurate. So with Goldcorp, I think the initial system gave them 80% advanced accuracy of advanced warning roughly 3 months in advance. But once they started getting more and more data, they actually got to mid to high 90s accuracy. And again, ROI is fairly straightforward as well. So I think let me stop on here, and I can give you examples probably for another 5 hours, but let's talk about some of the lessons learned. If you look at sort of how the companies got started on these IoT journeys, first of all, they had a big vision, but they started really, really small, right? They tried not to be a hero. They didn't try to reinvent the wheel. They focused on one plant, one use case. Let's get it right the first time. They would actually often quite often come to the event like this, talk to their peers, talk to the presenters, try to assess, okay, if I'm thinking about this remote asset management use case, where is the industry? Where am I in terms of TCO and ROI? And if there's a gap, this became a foundation for the business case. And then if they worked for a large company, the next logical step was to get support from a C-suite executive. And it makes sense, right? Because when you think about IoT journey, you're not just starting on a first project. You're not just starting on or developing one solution. You are truly starting on a journey, on a digital transformation journey, and it will have a big impact and transform your company and your industry. So you'd better have support from top management because it will not be a smooth ride. You will have a lot of naysayers, a lot of challenges on the way. So securing the top management support was really key. And then they built a coalition of the willing, their virtual team internally, cross-functionally, but also externally. I'll talk about that in a moment as well. If you work for a small and medium-sized company, your path would be slightly different. You would actually focus on identifying an integrator that has experience in your industry with your use case. And both of those are really critical. And the good news is over the last 5 years, we've actually developed, and many of you are sitting here in the room, a very robust ecosystem of experts who can help small and medium companies implement these types of use case in a cost-effective way. Some of the other sort of takeaways are obviously mistakes. And I'm not going to go through all the list here. I actually identified probably around 20 sort of common mistakes that customers and organizations have made that I've observed in their first or second IoT project. But one of the most common ones was to develop IoT solutions in isolation from the business process. So focusing on the technology, focusing on, hey, I got this right, how come it doesn't work? Let me give you a very trivial example. So a city installed an inflow management system for manholes for sewers. And the solution actually was designed perfectly, was working perfectly, but the ROI did not materialize because they forgot that there was a corresponding business process above the ground on the street, basically sweepers going in and dumping a bunch of garbage and leaves and everything else into the manhole. It's a trivial example, but once they've identified a problem, okay, well, let's change how we do things and let's stop clogging these manholes, and the ROI has materialized. I know it's a simple example, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen it when there was a focus on technology and not thinking about how do I integrate it with the business process? How do I change the business process? How do I start with the business process rather than the technology? A few other sort of implications of IoT implementations, and I think there has been a little discussion even yesterday and today about this topic. In the technology world, we used to this model of us building successful businesses based on open standards and us working together as the coalition and partnerships as well. But in many of the IoT industries, the business structures have been different. There has been a lot of focus on vertical integration, where one vendor will build a complete train station or a complete auto rig. So what we are seeing actually is that a lot of end customers are using the power of IoT, the value proposition of IoT in terms of cost, in terms of speed, the need for latest technology, to drive the change in the market structures from sort of a proprietary, one company does it all, into the model that in the technology world we're more familiar with, which is open standards, open systems, multiple vendors and customers working together to develop a solution. It's a big, big, big change, and it's happening at a different pace depending on the industry, and some of the established players are working and driving it. Some of them are resisting that as well. Some other implications. I kind of have joked that IoT is 10% technology and 90% the rest, right? And focus on the talent is another big implication and a challenge. There's been a lot of talk over the last few months about manufacturing jobs. And it is fair to say that if you look at manufacturing jobs in the US and Europe, there are actually tens of thousands of these jobs that don't get filled every year because we actually don't have qualified people to fill them. So what I've seen some of the leading IoT companies that are implementing IoT successfully, they've actually dramatically changed how they approach talent. And they're focusing more on developing their workforce internally, but also becoming more creative externally. So internally, the biggest shift is how do I get my workforce to adopt this culture of constant learning? Again, something that in the technology industry we may be taking for granted, right? Where when I think about my jobs, I've been at Cisco for 17 years. I've had 7 different jobs. Basically, reinvented myself every 2 or 3 years. But in some of these industries, people come into their job and saying, well, I expect to do the same job 10 years from now. It probably will not change much, right? Into this model of, well, I have to actually adopt. But it's so critical, right? Because these companies have realized that if they want to be successful on their IoT journey, it's not sufficient to just do a one training session on here's a new technology, here is your new interface, good luck, right? No, you have to change the culture. You have to change and invest in your workforce. And also externally, the company started to work with, let's say, educational institutions on the IoT courses and IoT curricula, so that you don't just get a generic data scientist, you get a data scientist that actually can interpret your data. There's actually much bigger focus now over the last few years on apprenticeships in the US. Big thing in Europe, but apprenticeships have sort of been a forgotten tool until recently. Federal government, I believe 2 years ago, announced a $100 million fund to promote it. But I do see more and more companies actually focusing on it because it's a win-win, right, for the potential employee, but also for an employer, like getting much better qualified people to come in and work with them. And maybe the last consequence I wanted to mention of IoT implementations is increased focus on the new business models, service-oriented business models. And now that everything is getting connected, you're actually getting the data, and you can make intelligent decisions. Increasingly, the organizations are shifting from a product to service-oriented business models. Because now you can actually see the value, and it's obviously driven by the bottom line, and you see how you can implement the model where you actually buy capacity instead of operating the plant. So a couple of more takeaways, and I think we've had these discussions yesterday and today as well. Obviously, security. My take, when I look at working with the industries, we've been on an interesting journey over the last 10 years or so. If you look at, let's say, the industrial folks, a couple of years ago, a lot of folks were still sort of thinking of security. I kind of jokingly call it security by obscurity or by denial, right? Well, my plant is not connected to the outside world, thus I'm secure. And of course, 5 years ago, Stuxnet proved them wrong. Then they actually started using some modern tools, and discovered that their vendors and contractors are actually running a bunch of virtual private networks into their plants. So the whole bubble burst. But the good news is that the industry has actually been making a great progress in adopting policy-based architectures. We are seeing CISOs, chief security officers, now increasingly taking ownership not only for the IT side of the house, but for the entire infrastructure, implementing the best practices and best sort of architectures. Not only before, meaning how quickly I can identify somebody who's hacking me, because let's be frank, every organization will get hacked sometime. But also during, how quickly I can identify that I have been hacked and what data has been compromised. And then after, how do I remediate, how do I deal with this problem? It is also fair to say that the denial of service attacks that we saw a couple of months ago I think have served as a good wake-up call for the industry. When I talk to the major security players, pretty much all of them now started to put the right investments in IoT, where even 6 or 9 months ago, many of them, I think, were under-investing in IoT security. And then we're starting to see the good things happening with focus on standards, focus on interoperability, and so forth. Sort of reminds me of, for those of you who remember 15 years ago or so, where the Wi-Fi industry got together and started dealing with the security issues there. So we're still not where we need to be, but I think the industry is moving in the right direction. But my take is that I think security is not just about the business leaders. It's not about just about vendors. It is actually everybody's responsibility. Yes, it's vendors, it's businesses, but it's also users. Come on, if you connect a camera in your home, you actually need to think about whether it has default name and password, right? But it's also employees, and employees integrating and incorporating security best practices, including physical security, into everything they do. As we know, half of the security incidents actually come from the inside of the organization. So if somebody is tailgating you when you're entering data center, well, pay attention. And maybe the last sort of an area of focus, and again, we had some discussions on this earlier, which is around standards. Again, when I think about the industry I've been in some way we've been lucky, right? We've had a handful of standard bodies that we've worked with, IETF, IEEE, and where we worked together as industry to sort of evolve our horizontal standards. But we all know that IoT is not a one market. It's a collection of markets and a collection of sub-markets, and it's actually very, very complicated. And the standard body sort of ecosystem is reflecting this very well. And I would basically look at these 3 categories. So the horizontal standard body efforts, there are industry-specific standard body efforts, and of course consortia, and we've been talking about those as well. So the good news is that the industry is getting together and working in these 3 areas, right? I kind of joke that when you think about GE, Rockwell, Honeywell, Emerson, Yokogawa versus Cisco, Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, we used to operate as if we were on different planets, right? But now we actually are working together in these forums. So if you look at horizontal forums like IEEE or IETF, like we have been doing over the last 3 years now, incorporating IoT requirements into the standards. Like, for example, time-sensitive networking in IEEE is a good example. We're also working with the vertical or industry-specific standard bodies like ODVA, ISA, and others to make sure that we incorporate the best of both worlds, but also that each of these standard bodies don't reinvent the wheel. So we don't have 55 data frame sort of standards for sensors, right? Let's just have one. And last but not least, obviously, we've talked about yesterday about Industrial Internet Consortium, or another example of consortium is Open Fog Consortium that just announced their reference architecture yesterday here. So, so the good news is that work is happening. It is much more complex, thus slower, and it takes a lot of effort. I can tell you from Cisco, it takes much more effort for us because we have to now be in 20 or 30 standard bodies in terms of, or instead of 5 or 6. So hopefully you're getting sort of a feel that it takes a lot, and it's fairly complex to start on the IoT journey. And that, as I mentioned earlier, technology is sort of a small part of that. There is a lot to be considered in terms of talent and change management and culture and partner ecosystem and so forth. And I also realize that it may be overwhelming for a lot of end customers when they need to think about all of these things. So what I did is I tried to sort of summarize this. I call it, with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, my recipe for IoT success. And there are 8 elements there that I thought, looking at the examples of folks that have started on their journeys, that these are sort of the 8 elements that if you pay attention to them and you integrate them into your plan, your chances of success will be much higher. I'm not going to go through all of them again, but you would see some familiar statements here. Build a partner ecosystem or integrate technology solution with business process. So to summarize, so those of you, and I know we have a lot of IoT enthusiasts here, so for those of you who've already started on the IoT journey, congratulations. But those of you who haven't, who came here to sort of figure out how you get started, please do so. The sooner you get started with even the most mundane project, the sooner you will start reaping the benefits. So how do you get started? First of all, don't be a hero. Don't reinvent the wheel. Pick one of the 4 fast paths to payback that I mentioned earlier, because thousands of your peers have already done those kind of projects. Then integrate and internalize these 8 recipes of IoT success that I've mentioned. And lastly, learn from your peers' mistakes so that you don't have to repeat them as well. And then just get going. All right, I would like to welcome everybody to Generation IoT. Thank you so much.